It was a long time ago. In my late teens, I was chronically ill, and right through into my late 20s, I ran the gamut, as so many people do, of this specialist and that specialist, being sent from one to the other, and I actually ended up in a psychiatric hospital being fed psychotropic drugs. And the head psychologist, professor, at one stage I kept saying, I've got pain in my stomach, and he patted me on the head physically and said, yes dear, but the mind plays funny tricks. And eventually a colleague at work suggested I try homeopathy. I'd never heard of it, so my GP knew a little, and he said, oh, it won't do you any harm, and the person you've been recommended to has got a very, very good reputation. He was a doctor. So I went along to this man, and I walked into his consulting room, and he said, go out and come in again. Oh, this is strange. So I did that, and he said, you've got one hip substantially higher than the other. And as well as being a homeopath, he was a very skilled osteopath. So he clicked things back into place, and the pain went. And I'd had that pain for something like 12 years, so I'm afraid I burst into tears. And then he said, and now we'll deal with your stomach. It was great, it was wonderful. But I was a patient. I didn't understand homeopathy, but I knew I was better, and I was very glad to be better. So I didn't question it, but our GP did. And then a couple of years later, we had our first child, and she didn't sleep. If we were lucky, she slept for 2 hours out of 24, and if we were extra lucky, it was the middle of the night. So after about 18 months of this, and we'd done everything that we'd been advised to do by various health visitors and all the rest of it, our GP said, go back and see that homeopathic doctor. So we phoned him up and we went along, and he said, oh, she's overstimulating herself, because she was always happy. She wasn't crying, but she was just awake. So he said, I'll give her a dose of coffee. So, because he said, if you take too much coffee, that's what happens. So he gave her 1 tablet of coffea, and that night she slept for 8 hours. We didn't sleep a wink. We kept checking that she was okay. But our GP said, right, I'm going to study this. So he went off to the Glasgow hospital and did the training for doctors. And he said, I was a journalist at the time, and I'd written about this, and our phone rang off the hook with people wanting to know. And he said, right, you set up a house group, and I'll come and pass on the information for young families and first aid situations that I'm learning about in Glasgow. Well, the house group was too big for the house. So we set up a local group in Lothian in Scotland, and very quickly we realised that we needed to be able to access treatment. And the only free facility in Scotland at that time was the Glasgow hospital, which was at the other side of the country, and not everybody could get there. So we campaigned for an NHS clinic near Edinburgh successfully, and we ended up with 3. It was wonderful. It took a lot of what the doctors call teeth patients. Teeth is their acronym for tried everything else, try homeopathy. And then after we had run it for about 10 or 12 years, I think it was, NHS Lothian became much more corporate, influenced very much by Big Pharma. They had Big Pharma people, a huge conflict of interest on their board. And despite a vigorous campaign, they closed the clinics. So I was a member of the patient organisation in the UK, the British Homeopathic Association as it was then, now Homeopathy UK, and I was writing letters asking for their help, and I wasn't getting a reply. So eventually, in fury, I wrote a sort of disgusted of Tunbridge Wells type letter, and the chief exec and the then chair came running up to Scotland. They were wonderful, they were very supportive, but they had no idea that the Scottish health system was different from that of England and Wales. So stupidly I said, oh, you need a Scottish trustee. And before I knew it, I was their Scottish trustee. And then things were a little bit unhappy. The trustees had been in place for a long time. The chair had been in place for a long time. It had become a little bit of a benevolent dictatorship, I suppose. And about my 3rd meeting in, there was a vote of no confidence in the chair, and before I knew it, I was the chair. So through that, I mean, it's been a wonderful 8 or 9 years, and we've turned things around, and Homeopathy UK really is now a force to be reckoned with in the UK, and we've now got 9 charitable clinics around the UK where patients can self-refer and get free treatment. And as a result of that, it was suggested that I come on the European group to represent patients, so here we are. I think conventional medicine has gone down the route largely of anti-treatment, so it's antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, antidepressants, which suppress the symptoms but don't necessarily get to the root of the illness, whereas homeopathy goes on the similar route. Immunology is that system as well. So you give somebody a little of something that would cause the illness in a healthy person, and that stimulates the body's own immune system to treat itself. I mean, this is not a new idea. This goes back to Hippocrates and the ancient Greeks. But the other thing about homeopathy is it's non-toxic. I don't know what it's like in Europe, I'm sure it's the same, but in the British environment, our rivers are full of the residue from chemicals, from pharmaceuticals. In Royal Deeside, which is a rural area, they tested the water in the River Dee, and it was just a horrendously high proportion of pharmaceutical drugs in it, which people had excreted. That's not in a big city. So homeopathy doesn't do that. So it's very sustainable, it's very eco, it's very green. It's also very, very cost effective. I think the wheel turns, and I think we've been through a bad time, but there have always been bad times in homeopathy because I think people are envious of its success and feel threatened by that, and because it's been difficult to explain the mechanism of action, that's been down, but there's more and more very good research being carried out so that people who need to know that information can have it. But in fact, we didn't know how aspirin worked. For years we were using it, but we didn't know how it worked. And the patients don't actually mind how something works, they just want it to work. So patients vote with their feet. And there are more and more people using homeopathy. It's the second most used medical treatment in the world. It's a very popular therapy, and where the patients want something, the doctors provide it. And now actually there are more doctors becoming involved in sustainable medicine, in integrative health. When we first established the Lothian group, I used to give talks to various local groups, and then that stopped, that died out. People didn't want to know, but it started again, and again I'm being asked locally to give talks on what is homeopathy, and people are very, very interested. I think it's the mood of the century, really. People are concerned about the environment, about the damage that we do through pollution and all the toxins, and they recognise that this is something, first of all, it's holistic, so it's looking at the whole person, but secondly, it's environmentally very friendly. I think, as a patient, probably it has to be arnica, and when our children were small, and we live in a very small village, so you know everybody, and I can remember the play scheme first aid box was a homeopathic first aid box, and now these children are parents themselves, and they say to me, "Margaret, how do I know about homeopathy?" And I said, "Because we all used it." You know, I remember one friend, her little boy, he was just toddling, and he banged his head on the corner of the table, and there was a huge lump. And she gave him an arnica tablet, and she said, "Margaret, I watched the lump go down. It was amazing." I joined DCH because I came, first of all, representing UK patients. And at a meeting 8 years ago now, the coordinator of the documentation committee asked if there was anybody from the UK who could join them, because they had no contacts with the documentation centres for homeopathy in the UK, and there are several libraries and collections. And through my chairmanship of Homeopathy UK, I knew these people, I knew these libraries, because quite often we'd given them grants. So I said, well, I'm not a librarian or an archivist or a documentalist, but I have the contacts, so if you would like, I will come on board. And because the language of ECH is English, and I'm one of the few native English speakers, I was asked to take the minutes. When she retired, and then the next coordinator retired, I and another person took on, we jointly coordinated the group, and therefore I became a member of the council. And again, because I was a native English speaker, although I'm Scots, I was asked to edit all their policy documents and papers that we're putting out. So gradually I've been given, I used to be a teacher, so teachers are fixers, and some of the administration was a little bit wild and woolly. So I'm now the membership secretary, I'm the assistant treasurer, and I edit the newsletter. and support you with the social media. I'm on the PR and Communications Working Group, and it does what it says on the tin, but already we've increased our social media presence and our following, our profile has risen substantially. The next thing that we're going to be working on is the revamp of the website.